Hey guys, this is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here with our DraftKings wide receiver picks for week 2. There's guys at all ends of the spectrum, basically. A couple guys at the high end that I like, a couple guys at the low end. And I'm going to give you some of the reasons behind that and some of the guys who I think you should be using over some other guys and the reasons why. The first guy I want to talk about here today is Antonio Brown. The wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers is one of the safest plays that I'm able to use almost every week in cash games. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why. If you look at his price up at $8,800, he's right next to guys like Julio Jones and Odell Beckham, who are also guys that are used very highly in daily fantasy. The reason why I like Antonio Brown is, of those three guys, he is the hardest one of those three to game plan against. Basically, with a guy like Julio or a guy like Beckham, what we saw last week with Beckham is that they're able to double him and bracket him, put a safety over the top on his side of the field, have a cornerback who beats him up at the line and basically makes it tough for him to get those quick passes, and then put a safety over the top so when he does beat that corner, there's still somebody running with him man-to-man. Now, the reason why this is tough is that defensive coordinators usually try to take away what the other team does well. And with the New York Giants, they do pass the ball well, and everybody remembers the big games that Beckham had at the end of last season. It's not going to be as easy for him this year, especially with the Giants not having a ton of other weapons that really force teams to kind of play it straight. They're going to be able to double him all season long, and that's going to hurt his numbers. I think the same thing is going to happen to Julio Jones in this game because everybody basically saw what he was able to do on Monday night. I don't think he's going to have an easy time of it. I think there's going to be safety help rolling over the top. And I think that the Atlanta team is going to have to make an adjustment and either throw the ball in the other direction or keep the ball on the ground in order to really have some success today. With a guy like Antonio Brown, though, he doesn't get targeted down the field as often as these other guys do. So the fact that you can try to, double him down the field isn't really going to hurt what he does. Brown usually catches a lot of what we like to call those long handoff type passes. Where he goes and has a wide receiver screen, or he fakes like he's going to go long, steps back, catches a pass right at the line of scrimmage, and then picks up his yards after the catch that way. He's a guy who winds up with anywhere between 7 to 12 balls every game, not targets, actual balls that he catches every game, and usually winds up somewhere around 100 yards. I do expect this Pittsburgh team to put up a good amount of points in this game, so I think Antonio Brown is going to be the way, especially with Le'Veon Bell and Martavius Bryant still basically on the sidelines with their suspension. I think you're going to see a heavy dose of a guy like Antonio Brown, probably also a little bit of Heath Miller mixed in there as well, because there just aren't that many pass-catching options left on that Pittsburgh Steelers team. The next guy that I want to talk about is somebody who has a lot of upside and a lot of things going in his favor, in my eyes, and that's Brandin Cooks. Now, I know a couple of you guys just shuddered because you probably had him last week when he didn't have a very big game against Arizona in the opener. But I think that had a lot to do with the game plan and the game flow. First off, he had Patrick Peterson on him the entire game, and Patrick Peterson did a very good job of, sticking with him. He's somebody who a lot of people were expecting a lot out of before this season started. But with that Arizona pass rush, the idea for the New Orleans Saints last week was to kind of get the ball out of Drew Brees' hands fast. There were a lot of checkdowns. There were a lot of swing passes. There were a lot of short routes to, guys crossing over the middle. So basically, it didn't work out all that well in Cook's favor for him to get targeted down the field as often as we would have liked. And he also didn't get as many targets in the passing game because they were kind of concentrating on stopping him, which left a lot of room out in the flat for the running backs to do some work, which is basically how the Saints decided to attack Arizona. In a game like today, he goes up against Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay got lit up in their opening game by Marcus Mariota in his first start as an NFL quarterback. And one of the big guys who had a big game for them was Kendall Wright, who was able to take a slant pass and take it all the way to the house. Also had a bunch of other catches, both on top of the defense and underneath in front of him. And I think that Cooks is a very similar type receiver to Kendall Wright, which means that I think that Cooks has a very big chance to have a big game like Kendall Wright did last weekend. Let's see. I also really like using a guy like Cooks today. His price is only $7,000, and there's a lot of people in that never again crowd who got burned by him last week that are probably not going to be coming back onto him this week. Even though this week it's a much better spot for him, Brees should be able to throw the ball downfield a little more often. And since Cooks didn't have a big game in week 1, Breeze is the kind of guy, as we saw last year, who will feed somebody who didn't have a big game to kind of get them going. He used to do it all the time with Jimmy Graham. Whenever Jimmy Graham had a bad game, he would come back the next game and Breeze would look to get the ball into his hands, get him a whole bunch of targets. So I think Cooks is going to be the guy that's in that situation today. I expect New Orleans to wind up beating this Tampa Bay team, but I think this game is in Tampa Bay, which means that Tampa does have a chance to keep this game close, which is good because that means that New Orleans will have to keep passing instead of just dominating the ball on the ground and running it with Mark Ingram 25 or 30 times. I do also like Ingram in this game, but I do think that Cooks has a chance for a big upside. The next guy I want to play is somebody who I absolutely love, and that's John Brown. He's 6,200 going up against that Chicago Bears defense that gave up 3 passing touchdowns last weekend to the Green Bay Packers. Now, the thing I love about Brown is he's basically the apple of Carson Palmer's eye right now. Anytime that Palmer has to scramble, anytime Palmer has to go out of the pocket, John Brown is the guy that has speed, always coming back to the ball, always working hard to try to get himself open. And it seemed like every time Palmer got himself in a little trouble, his eyes automatically went to Brown to see where Brown was. And if Brown even got an inch of daylight, Palmer was throwing him the ball. That's what happened on the touchdown pass he had in the end zone. It happened also later on in the game on a couple third down options where Brown was able to shake free and make a couple big catches. I mean, this guy is a legitimate NFL receiver. I know people are worried about volume with guys like Michael Floyd and Larry Fitzgerald, but honestly, even though John Brown is not the household name, he's basically the number 1 receiver on that team. He's the guy that Palmer looks for the most and is probably the guy with the most upside. He has the ability to stretch defense deep. He also has the ability to find the hole in the zone and be more of a PPR kind of guy. So I definitely think that this is going to be a good matchup for him. Remember, Chicago had one of the worst defenses against the pass last year, which is why everybody was targeting guys like, Rodgers and Cobb and Devontae Adams in week 1 against them because they are a pretty easy team to throw the ball against. I think Arizona is going to be throwing. I think Carson Palmer is going to be in a good spot here. And I think if Palmer's throwing it enough, he's going to find his favorite receiver in John Brown pretty often on Sunday. The next guy I want to talk about is Jordan Matthews for the Philadelphia Eagles. I still think Matthews' price is a little bit too cheap. This guy's a PPR monster in a high-pace offense, and they're going to need him this week in order to be able to score some points and keep up with that Dallas team. It's a very high total in this game. We should see a lot of passing. I think it's going to go back and forth, much like the Philly and Atlanta game did. Even a little bit like the Dallas and the Giants game did. I know people are expecting Dallas to keep it on the ground against, keep it on the ground here today against Philly. But I don't think that they're going to be able to keep up with Philly if they're just going to try to run Joseph Randle the entire game. I do love that Dallas offensive line, but I think they're going to have to pass. And without a guy like Des Bryant, who's hurt, I think that those passes are still going to be coming even from that Dallas team, which means that Philly's going to have to be throwing the ball as well to keep up with them. The next guy I like also in this game is on the other side of that game, speaking of Des Bryant being out, and that's Terrence Williams. Terrence Williams is really cheap at only 4,200. With no Des, he should be the number 1 target as far as wide receivers go. I still think Witten's going to be the guy who gets targeted the most and probably sees the most red zone looks, but I think Terrence Williams is going to be pretty close behind. There was an interesting development that happened earlier this week. Apparently, right now, Dallas is considering starting Devin Streeter as their wide receiver 2 in this game, even though most people thought it was Cole Beasley. So the question a lot of people have been asking all week is Cole Beasley or Terrence Williams. And for me, if Beasley's only going to be the slot guy and he's probably only going to play, maybe 50 or 60% of the snaps, I'm thinking it's a very easy decision for me if I'm taking anybody in that Dallas pass catching crew to go over to Terrence Williams at only 4,200. I think he's just a little bit too cheap. Remember, the pricing came out before Des Bryant got hurt in that Sunday night game. The pricing for this slate was already up. So Terrence Williams' price jump hasn't been factored in the fact that he's going to be bigger part of that offense. And neither has Derek Streeter's or Cole Beasley's for that matter. All these guys are cheap. Like I said, Williams is my favorite, but if you have somebody else that you like better, I think you can look at some of these Cowboys guys, especially in your cash game, because, like I said, they're all going to be getting a little more volume, and they're just way, way too cheap. Next guy I want to talk about. This one has a little bit more to do with some injury news that you're going to have to watch. But right now, it's looking like T.Y. Hilton may not play against the Jets this week. it's also looking like Antonio Cromartie on the other side of that game is not going to be playing as well. If that's the case, I think you're going to see Darrelle Revis lined up against Andre Johnson, which means that the guy coming in for T.Y. Hilton, Donte Moncrief, is going to have a softer matchup on the other side and is going to be somebody who's going to get a lot of targets if he's not lined up opposite of Revis. Moncrief is a guy who we used last year at times and had a decent week 1 performance. He has some ability. He's not a bad receiver. He has good upside, and his price is only $4,600. Now, if T.Y. is out, I do think that Indy is going to have to throw the ball in this game. I don't think they're going to be able to run it and win this game with Frank Gore against that Jets defense. So if you can get a guy like Moncrief, $4,600 with the start, if T.Y. Hilton is not able to play, I think he's almost a must use. And I would much rather use a guy like that than spend the $4,200 on Terrence Williams. Because like I said, I do still think that Witten's going to be the guy they look to in the red zone the most. Moncrief has big playability, and he's going to be seeing a lot of volume with a big bump if he is in there as the starter. So I do really, really like Moncrief this week, and I think if he's the starter, he's definitely somebody that you have to include in your rosters. The last guy I want to mention is somebody that, is basically something that I like to do a lot. Whenever a guy is highly owned and has a bad week, I always like to play him and put him into some of my tournament rosters the next week. Because a lot of people are in what I like to call the never again crowd. If you roster a guy and he's highly owned and you were expecting him to have a big day and he doesn't have a big day, the first thing that you're always thinking when you look at your lineups is, my God, I'm never starting this guy again. Well, that's usually not the right way to go. If you like this guy that much, there was probably something about him that made you really want to use him. And this is one of those games where, if you did really want to use a guy like Davante Adams last week, it's not the softest matchup in the world that he has today going up against that Seattle team, but I think they're going to need him to be a bigger part of that offense today. So I think today is actually a really good spot to roll him back out there again. His price is only $4,900, so he's not overly expensive. And again, everybody was expecting him to be a big PPR monster. I don't expect James Jones to have another 2-touchdown game. I think the touchdowns are going to be distributed out a little more evenly. I do think you're going to get Richard Sherman on Cobb for most of the game, which means that Davante is probably the guy who's going to have the softer matchup and should be the guy who gets the bigger, boost in volume. Again, there's other guys that you can look at here, guys like Julio and Beckham, who we mentioned earlier. I'm not saying they're not good plays. I'm just saying that, it's easier for teams to game plan around guys like that, which is why I don't know if I want to pay up for guys like that today. There's a whole bunch of guys in the mid-tier, guys like, we got a Jarvis Landry. He's somebody else who I think is pretty good. Again, you can look at a guy like Devin Streeter if he really is going to be getting those catches down there in Dallas. And that's pretty much it for the guys who are on the top of my list for this week. So thank you guys for joining us for the DraftKings wide receiver video. And as always, stay classy, DFS.